Paralyzed girl walks again through Padre Pio's miracle, a story that revives faith across a town. Standing in the crowded church of San Giovanni Rotondo, Sarah Anderson clutched her daughter Emily's hand, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the impossible. 8-year-old Emily, paralyzed since birth due to medical negligence, took her first steps. The marble floor echoed with gasps and prayers as the small girl, touched by Padre Pio's blessing moments before, walked toward the altar. But this miracle was more than just a healing. It was the culmination of a journey through darkness, corruption, and unwavering faith that would transform not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of justice and redemption. In the quiet suburbs of Boston, the Andersons once lived what many would consider the American dream. Sarah, a dedicated elementary school teacher with auburn hair and kind eyes, had married her college sweetheart Michael, a respected civil engineer whose gentle nature and unwavering moral compass made him beloved in their community. Their world revolved around their greatest blessing, their daughter Emily, whose bright blue eyes and infectious laugh could light up any room. But Emily's birth at Boston Metropolitan Hospital marked the beginning of their nightmare. What should have been a routine delivery turned catastrophic when the attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, ignored clear signs of fetal distress. Hours passed as Sarah's pleas for help went unheeded, lost in a system more concerned with protocols than patients. When Emily finally entered the world, the lack of oxygen had already caused devastating damage to her nervous system. The diagnosis came like a hammer blow: permanent paralysis from the waist down. The Andersons watched helplessly as their daughter, otherwise bright and alert, remained confined to her wheelchair, unable to experience the simple joy of taking her first steps or running through autumn leaves. Yet Emily possessed something remarkable, a spirit that refused to be dimmed by her circumstances. Even at 8 years old, she spoke with a wisdom that seemed to transcend her years, often comforting her parents when they thought she wasn't looking. Michael threw himself into research, spending countless nights poring over medical journals and case studies, desperate to find something the doctors might have missed. Sarah channeled her energy into adapting their home, transforming it into a space where Emily could thrive despite her limitations. Their savings dwindled as they invested in specialized equipment and therapeutic treatments, but they never complained. Every smile from Emily made it worthwhile. Their life settled into a rhythm of hospital visits, physical therapy sessions, and unwavering hope. Sarah continued teaching, her students' parents often commenting on how she seemed to have endless patience for children with special needs. Michael's engineering firm supported them with flexible hours and excellent health insurance, a blessing they wouldn't fully appreciate until later. The community initially rallied around them. Neighbors brought meals, church members offered prayers, and Emily's classmates adapted their games to include her. The Andersons became known as the family who faced adversity with grace and faith, their Sunday appearances at St. Patrick's Cathedral a testament to their enduring spirit. Emily, sitting in her wheelchair beside the pew, would sing hymns with such joy that other parishioners often found themselves moved to tears. But beneath this facade of acceptance and adaptation, the weight of injustice grew heavier. Every milestone Emily couldn't reach, every birthday wish for normal legs, every tear shed in private, they all stemmed from one terrible night of medical negligence. The Andersons discovered that Emily's case wasn't isolated. Other families had suffered similar fates at Boston Metropolitan, their stories buried under settlements and silence. When they finally gathered the courage to seek legal justice, they believed truth would prevail. Michael meticulously documented everything, building what they thought was an irrefutable case. Sarah kept detailed journals of Emily's daily challenges, each entry a testament to the life their daughter should have had. They remained hopeful, clinging to their faith in the system and in God's plan, unaware that their pursuit of justice would soon unleash forces that would test not just their faith, but their very survival as a family. Boston Metropolitan Hospital stood as a towering monument to modern medicine, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of hope. Behind this impressive exterior, Dr. Richard Thompson had built an empire over 3 decades, transforming a struggling hospital into the region's most profitable medical center. As chief of medicine and board chairman, his word was law, his decisions unquestioned. With carefully cultivated political connections and generous donations to the right causes, he had become untouchable. The day the Andersons filed their lawsuit, Thompson sat in his corner office, viewing the legal documents with cold calculation. Emily's case wasn't the first instance of medical negligence under his watch, but it threatened to expose a carefully constructed system of profit over patient care. Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician responsible for Emily's condition, had a history of complaints buried deep in hospital records, yet Thompson had protected him for years due to the lucrative research grants he attracted. The hospital's legal team, led by the ruthless Patricia Sterling, moved with practiced efficiency. They began by questioning Sarah's account of the delivery, suggesting that pre-existing conditions might have caused Emily's paralysis. Medical records were subtly altered, timestamps changed, and witness statements carefully massaged to create doubt. The corruption ran deep, with hospital staff who knew the truth staying silent out of fear or self-interest. Local media initially showed interest in the case, but a series of strategic advertising purchases and veiled threats quickly silenced most outlets. Those few journalists who persisted found their careers mysteriously stalled or their personal lives scrutinized. Thompson's influence extended far beyond the hospital walls, reaching into City Hall, the medical board, and even the judicial system. The Andersons' initial optimism crumbled as they faced the full force of Thompson's machine. Their lawyer, once confident, began suggesting settlement talks after receiving a private visit from Sterling. Expert witnesses suddenly became unavailable or changed their testimonies. Even their insurance company started questioning coverage for Emily's ongoing treatments, citing obscure policy clauses. The corruption's tentacles reached into the community itself. Whispers began circulating about Michael's mental stability and Sarah's competence as a mother. Anonymous letters arrived at their church suggesting that their pursuit of monetary gain showed a lack of Christian forgiveness. Parents at Emily's school, many employed by hospital-affiliated businesses, gradually withdrew their children from playdates. Dr. Webb, protected by the hospital's power, continued practicing, though he was quietly shifted to administrative duties. He avoided the Andersons in public, but his conscience gnawed at him each time he passed the pediatric ward. The weight of his complicity grew heavier, but the golden handcuffs Thompson had placed on him felt impossible to break. Thompson maintained his public persona as a philanthropist and medical pioneer, while privately orchestrating the systematic destruction of the Andersons' case. He viewed them not as a family seeking justice, but as a threat to be eliminated. In board meetings, he spoke of maintaining institutional integrity and preventing frivolous lawsuits while his network of influence tightened around the Andersons like a noose. When the judge, a frequent guest at Thompson's charitable galas, dismissed the case with prejudice, it seemed like the final victory for the hospital's corruption. The Andersons were left with crushing legal debts and a daughter whose future medical care now hung in the balance. Thompson celebrated with his inner circle, confident that his empire remained secure, unaware that his actions had set in motion events that would eventually lead to his downfall, events that would begin with a desperate mother's prayer and a miracle that even his power couldn't explain away. The first time Sarah heard about Dr. James Morrison, she was sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop near the courthouse, drowning her sorrows in lukewarm coffee after another failed appeal. A well-meaning stranger, noticing her tears, slipped her a business card featuring a photo of a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and kind eyes. "He works miracles," the stranger whispered, disappearing before Sarah could ask questions. The card promised alternative healing and breakthrough treatments for the incurable. Desperation has a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. After weeks of research, Sarah discovered that Morrison had a following, parents of children with various disabilities who swore he had helped them when traditional medicine failed. His clinic, nestled in an upscale part of Connecticut, looked legitimate enough with its marble floors and state-of-the-art equipment. The consultation fee alone was steep, but Michael and Sarah scraped together the money, clinging to hope. Dr. Morrison carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything. During their first meeting, he spoke with authority about experimental stem cell treatments and revolutionary physical therapy techniques. He showed them videos of children who supposedly regained mobility under his care. Emily, sitting quietly in her wheelchair, watched him with an uncharacteristic wariness that Sarah would later wish she had heeded. The treatment plan he proposed was extensive and astronomically expensive. "Quality comes at a price," he said smoothly, sliding across a contract thick with medical jargon and legal disclaimers. The Andersons began liquidating everything they owned: their home equity, retirement accounts, even Michael's beloved vintage car collection. Friends and family members were approached for loans, each request accompanied by desperate explanations and promises of repayment. Their church community split over the decision. Some members organized fundraisers, while others openly questioned the wisdom of trusting an unconventional doctor. "God helps those who help themselves," Sarah would reply when faced with doubt, though the words felt hollow even to her. Every Sunday she lit candles and prayed for guidance, wondering if she was following divine intervention or foolish hope. The treatments began with much fanfare. Morrison's clinic was always bustling with activity, though patients never seemed to cross paths. Emily endured hours of painful procedures, her brave smile never wavering even as tears rolled down her cheeks. "It hurts because it's working," Morrison would assure them, always ready with an explanation for why immediate results weren't visible. Weeks turned into months. The Andersons' savings vanished into Morrison's accounts, along with money borrowed from everyone who would lend to them. Michael took a second job working nights at a warehouse while Sarah started tutoring after school. They sold their furniture, lived on rice and beans, and cut every possible expense. Emily watched her parents' exhaustion grow, her young heart carrying a burden no child should bear. The first red flag came when another patient's family contacted them through social media, sharing a story disturbingly similar to their own. Then came the unexplained cancellations of appointments, the increasingly evasive answers about Emily's progress, and the pressure to commit to more expensive advanced treatments. The clinic staff began turning over rapidly, with new faces appearing each visit, none seeming to know Emily's case history. Sarah started noticing small inconsistencies: identical progress photos shown to different families, certificates on the wall with dates that didn't quite match Morrison's claimed experience, and a growing number of negative reviews that disappeared from websites almost as quickly as they appeared. The dawning realization that they had been deceived crept in like a slow-acting poison, paralyzing their ability to act even as their resources dwindled to nothing. When they finally gathered the courage to demand answers, Morrison's clinic was empty, its offices stripped bare over a weekend. The phone numbers were disconnected, the website gone, and their medical records nowhere to be found. They weren't alone. Dozens of families across the country had fallen victim to his elaborate scheme, each carrying the same burden of shame, debt, and shattered hopes. The morning they discovered Morrison's deception dawned cold and grey, matching the emptiness in Sarah's heart as she stared at the abandoned clinic's facade. Michael stood beside her, his normally strong shoulders slumped in defeat, holding a stack of bounced checks and unpaid medical bills. The weight of their financial ruin crashed down like a physical force, but it was the look in Emily's eyes, a mixture of guilt and wisdom far beyond her years, that broke them completely. The aftermath unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. Creditors began calling day and night, their sympathetic tones gradually hardening into threats. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home, unmoved by Sarah's tearful explanations. Friends who had lent them money grew distant, their silence at church more damning than any words could be. The community that had once embraced them now viewed them with a mixture of pity and judgment, whispering about their foolishness in trusting an obvious fraud. Michael retreated into himself, spending hours in his study, surrounded by financial documents, desperately trying to find a way out of their situation. The proud engineer, who once designed bridges now couldn't meet his daughter's gaze, ashamed of his failure to protect his family. Sarah would find him there late at night, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, their life savings reduced to worthless pieces of paper scattered across his desk. The final blow came when Michael's engineering firm announced layoffs. Despite his years of service, he was among the first to go, a decision suspiciously timed after Dr. Thompson's company became a major client. With no income and mounting debts, they were forced to move into a small apartment in a neighborhood they once would have avoided. Emily's wheelchair barely fit through the narrow doorways, and the building's lack of proper accessibility made every day a challenge. One rainy Tuesday evening, Michael kissed Emily goodnight with unusual tenderness. He hugged Sarah longer than normal, whispering "I'm sorry" in her ear before heading out for what he said was a late-night job interview. The police found his car the next morning at Harrison Bridge, his neatly folded jacket containing a letter that began, "My insurance will give you a fresh start." His body was recovered 3 days later, leaving behind a devastated family and a policy that would never pay out due to the suicide clause. The funeral was sparsely attended. Most of their former friends stayed away, as if misfortune were contagious. Emily sat in her wheelchair beside her mother, her small hand reaching up to squeeze Sarah's whenever the sobs became too much to bear. "Daddy's with the angels," now she would say, her faith unmarred by the tragedy surrounding them. But Sarah's own faith wavered dangerously, her prayers turning into angry questions about divine justice and unanswered pleas for help. The local newspaper ran a small story about Michael's death, mentioning the Morrison scandal in passing. The article painted them as gullible victims who should have known better, their tragedy served up as a cautionary tale about desperation and blind faith. Dr. Thompson was quoted expressing deep regret about the situation, his words of sympathy ringing hollow against the backdrop of their destroyed lives. In the weeks that followed, Sarah moved through life like a ghost. She took a leave of absence from teaching, unable to face the pitying looks from colleagues and parents. Their days fell into a grim routine of medical appointments they could barely afford and meetings with debt collectors who showed no mercy. Emily's physical therapy sessions were reduced to whatever Sarah could manage at home, their dreams of healing now seeming like a cruel joke. The only constant was Emily's unwavering spirit. Despite everything, she continued to smile, to pray, to believe. "God has a plan, Mummy," she would say, wiping away Sarah's tears with her small hands. But on the darkest nights, when Emily was asleep, Sarah found herself questioning everything she had ever believed in. Her daughter's faith felt like both a blessing and a rebuke, highlighting her own spiritual crisis as she grappled with the loss of her husband and the seeming indifference of heaven to their suffering. The first mention of Padre Pio came from an unexpected source, Emily herself. During one of their increasingly rare visits to St. Patrick's Cathedral, the little girl had wheeled herself to the church library after Mass, returning with a worn book about the stigmatized saint. "Look, Mummy," she said, her finger tracing over a black-and-white photograph of the priest with piercing eyes. "He helps people like me. He understands pain." Sarah initially dismissed it as childish fantasy, her heart too scarred by Morrison's deception to embrace another possibility of healing. But Emily's fascination with Padre Pio grew. She read everything she could find about him, spending hours copying his prayers in her careful schoolgirl handwriting. At night she would tell her mother stories about his miracles, her eyes shining with an inner light that Sarah hadn't seen since before Michael's death. "He knows we're coming," Mummy Emily announced one morning over breakfast, with the certainty that only children possess. "I dreamed about him last night. He was crying because you're so sad, but he said God hasn't forgotten us." Sarah nearly dropped her coffee cup, startled by the echo of her late husband's gentle optimism in her daughter's voice. That same day, a mysterious envelope arrived containing a magazine article about Padre Pio's healing powers, with a San Giovanni Rotondo travel brochure tucked inside. The church's reaction to Emily's growing devotion was mixed. Father David, their parish priest, cautioned against building up false hopes. "Miracles are rare, Sarah," he said kindly but firmly. "Perhaps it's time to accept God's will." Others were less gentle, suggesting that Emily's fixation on Padre Pio bordered on obsession. One church elder even implied that their family's misfortunes were divine punishment for not accepting their cross with sufficient grace. But Emily remained undeterred. She started a small prayer group with other children after Sunday school, sharing stories about Padre Pio and praying for those in need. Adults who came to scoff found themselves moved by the simple, pure faith of these young believers. Even some of the hospital staff who had turned against them began secretly slipping Emily prayer requests, touched by her unwavering conviction that God heard every petition. The idea of traveling to Italy seemed impossible. They could barely afford groceries, let alone international airfare. Yet Emily's faith began working subtle changes in their lives. A distant cousin offered them frequent flyer miles. An anonymous donor through the church provided a small grant for medical travel. Sarah's students organized a bake sale that raised more money than anyone expected. Slowly, impossibly, the pieces began falling into place. Not everyone supported their plans. Dr. Thompson's influence reached far, and rumors circulated that the trip was another scam, a way to avoid paying their debts. Some suggested that Child Protective Services should investigate Sarah for endangering her daughter with false hopes. The local newspaper ran a skeptical piece about miracle-seeking families that, while not naming them directly, clearly referenced their story. Through it all, Emily's faith never wavered. She learned Italian phrases from library books, practiced them in her prayers, and spoke confidently about meeting Padre Pio as if it were already accomplished fact. Her certainty began to affect others, first her doctors, then her teachers, and finally even some of their former critics. There was something compelling about her simple trust that made cynicism seem small and mean-spirited in comparison. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Emily into bed, her daughter grabbed her hand with unexpected strength. "Daddy's helping us get to Padre Pio," she whispered. "He comes in my dreams and says everything will be all right if we just believe." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, remembering how Michael had always said that nothing was impossible with enough faith. For the first time since his death, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The flight to Italy stretched their limited resources to the breaking point. Sarah had sold her wedding ring, the last valuable thing she owned, to cover unexpected expenses. The well-worn wheelchair barely survived the baggage handlers, one wheel wobbling ominously as they navigated the unfamiliar streets of San Giovanni Rotondo. The small hotel they could afford sat far from the sanctuary, requiring a daily struggle up steep, cobblestone streets that seemed designed to reject modern wheelchairs. Their first attempt to see Padre Pio ended in crushing disappointment. The stern-faced monk at the monastery gate took one look at their travel-worn appearance and shook his head. "Padre Pio is not accepting new visitors," he said in broken English, his eyes flickering with something between pity and suspicion. "Too many come seeking miracles. He needs rest." Emily's face fell, but she squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, "It's okay, Mommy. We'll try again tomorrow." Word of their presence spread quickly through the small town. American tourists were common enough, but there was something about Emily that caught people's attention. Perhaps it was the way she prayed in the back of the church, her Italian pronunciation careful and determined, or how she smiled at everyone despite their obvious poverty. Local children began to visit her, drawn by her bright spirit and the candies she somehow always had to share, despite their meager resources. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through Maria, an elderly cleaning woman at their hotel. She found Emily alone in the lobby one evening, practicing her prayers, and stopped to listen. Something in the child's devotion moved her to tears. The next morning she pressed a crumpled note into Sarah's hand, a message to be delivered to Father Giuseppe, Padre Pio's personal secretary. "Tell him Maria De Luca sends you," she whispered, crossing herself. "Tell him you are the ones he dreamed about." Father Giuseppe proved to be a tall, austere man whose initial skepticism melted when he read Maria's note. He studied Emily intently, asking her questions about her faith and her dreams. Her answers, simple yet profound, seemed to strike a chord. "Padre Pio has been expecting you," he said finally. He spoke of a child whose faith would teach us all. But there are protocols, procedures. The Church must be careful. The waiting period that followed tested their endurance. Their money dwindled rapidly, forcing them to skip meals so they could extend their stay. Sarah took to washing dishes at a local restaurant in exchange for their dinner, while Emily spent hours in the church, her prayers mingling with the incense that perpetually hung in the air. Some of the other pilgrims, noticing their dedication, began sharing their food and offering small gifts of support. Opposition came from unexpected quarters. A group of local doctors, hearing about the American child seeking a miracle, sent a strongly worded letter to the monastery warning against giving false hope to a clearly hopeless case. Someone they suspected Thompson's influence reached even here contacted the American embassy with concerns about child exploitation. Each new obstacle seemed designed to break their spirit, yet Emily's faith remained unshaken. Their persistence gradually began to affect the monastery itself. Young monks would stop to talk with Emily, touched by her simple wisdom. Even the stern gatekeeper softened, eventually bringing her oranges from the monastery garden. Father Giuseppe visited more frequently, each time staying longer, obviously moved by the way Emily spoke about God with such natural familiarity. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the message came: Padre Pio would see them after his morning mass. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Those who had helped them celebrated as if it were their own victory. Maria wept openly as she helped Emily into her best dress, carefully saved for this moment. That night, Sarah lay awake, torn between hope and terror, while Emily slept peacefully, a small smile playing on her lips, as if she already knew what the next day would bring. The morning of their meeting with Padre Pio dawned with an ethereal mist clinging to the monastery walls. Sarah pushed Emily's wheelchair through the gathered crowd, their path cleared by Father Giuseppe, who walked ahead with purposeful strides. The morning mass had just ended, and the air still hung heavy with incense and whispered prayers. Emily sat straight in her chair, her small hands folded peacefully in her lap, exhibiting a composure that made her seem far older than her 8 years. Padre Pio's private chapel was smaller than Sarah expected, its simplicity a stark contrast to the ornate main church. The saint himself knelt at the altar, his prayer so intense he seemed unaware of their entrance. Sarah's first impression was of his frailty. He seemed almost transparent in the early morning light filtering through the stained glass windows, but when he finally turned to face them, his eyes carried a power that made her catch her breath. The stigmatic priest's initial reaction surprised everyone present. Instead of approaching Emily, he fixed his penetrating gaze on Sarah, speaking in Italian that Father Giuseppe hastily translated. "You carry much darkness," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "How can you expect God's light to work through such shadows?" Sarah felt exposed, as if every doubt, every bitter thought, every moment of lost faith lay bare before those knowing eyes. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to fall. It was Emily who broke the tension, wheeling herself forward despite protocol. "She's hurting because she loves me," she said in her carefully practiced Italian, reaching for Padre Pio's hand without fear. "But I knew you would help us. I saw you in my dreams, and Daddy said you would understand." The chapel fell silent. Even Father Giuseppe seemed to hold his breath as Padre Pio looked down at the child who dared to approach him with such confidence. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, to everyone's amazement, Padre Pio knelt beside Emily's wheelchair, taking her small hands in his stigmata-marked ones. "Your father speaks to you," he asked softly, no translation needed. Emily nodded, explaining how Michael visited her dreams, encouraging her faith even as her mother's wavered. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. Padre Pio began to weep, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. The transformation that followed was subtle yet profound. Padre Pio spoke at length with Emily, their conversation moving between Italian and what seemed like private understanding that transcended language. He listened intently to her descriptions of her father, nodding as if confirming facts only he could verify. Sarah watched in wonder as her daughter chatted with the mystic priest as naturally as if they were old friends, sharing insights about faith and suffering that seemed impossible for a child her age to comprehend. The discussion turned to forgiveness, with Padre Pio gently but firmly addressing Sarah's hidden bitterness. "Your husband's death was not God's punishment," he said, his words cutting through years of guilt and anger. "And your daughter's condition is not your failure. But healing requires more than physical change. It demands that you release the poison of hatred, even toward those who have wronged you." His words struck Sarah like physical blows, forcing her to confront the deep wells of resentment she harbored toward Thompson, Morrison, and even God himself. As morning stretched toward noon, other pilgrims waited anxiously outside, but Padre Pio seemed oblivious to time. He shared stories of his own struggles with suffering and doubt, speaking of the stigmata not as a blessing but as a profound responsibility. Emily listened with complete attention, asking questions that made the adults exchange surprised glances. When she described her own pain, not just physical but the ache of watching her mother's suffering, Padre Pio's expression reflected a deep understanding that needed no translation. The moment that changed everything came when Emily asked about her father's suicide. The question hung in the air like a thunderclap, Sarah's heart stopping at her daughter's directness. But Padre Pio's response carried a gentle wisdom that began to heal wounds they hadn't even acknowledged. "Your father's last act was born of love, however misguided," he explained. "He sees now that it was a mistake, but God's mercy is greater than any human error. He wants you both to know that he's at peace, and his love for you transcends death itself." These words triggered something in Sarah, a release of emotion so powerful she fell to her knees beside Emily's wheelchair. All the pain, anger, and guilt she'd carried since Michael's death poured out in racking sobs. Emily reached for her mother, her small hand stroking Sarah's hair just as Michael used to do. Padre Pio watched them with infinite compassion, his presence somehow containing and sanctifying their grief. The transformation wasn't dramatic or instantaneous, but everyone in the chapel could sense something fundamental shifting. The air itself seemed to change, becoming lighter, clearer. Sarah felt years of bitterness beginning to dissolve, replaced by a peace she hadn't known was possible. Emily's face glowed with an inner light that reminded those present of ancient stories of saints and mystics. As their time drew to a close, Padre Pio made an unprecedented request. He asked to see them again the next day, not just for a blessing but for ongoing spiritual guidance. Father Giuseppe later confided that in all his years with the saint, he had never seen him so moved by a pilgrim's visit. "There is something special here," he said, watching Emily and Sarah leave the chapel, "something that goes beyond mere physical healing." News of the extended meetings between Padre Pio and the American family spread through San Giovanni Rotondo like wildfire, eventually reaching beyond the small Italian town to attract wider attention. Dr. Thompson's influence, even across the Atlantic, cast its shadow when several American newspapers began running skeptical stories about miracle-seeking tourists and exploitative religious practices. A particularly vicious article implied that Sarah was using her daughter's condition to solicit donations from sympathetic pilgrims. The monastery received a flood of letters from Thompson's legal team, citing concerns about medical ethics and suggesting that any miraculous cure would be investigated as potential medical fraud. Local doctors, pressured by their American counterparts, began distancing themselves from the Andersons. Even their small hotel received anonymous calls questioning the wisdom of hosting guests who might bring unwanted attention. Despite these external pressures, Emily's daily meetings with Padre Pio continued, each session deeper and more profound than the last. The stigmatic priest seemed to draw energy from the child's presence, his own health visibly improving during their conversations. Other monks noted how he smiled more frequently, how his usual stern demeanor softened when Emily wheeled herself into the chapel. Their discussions ranged from simple matters of faith to complex theological concepts that Emily somehow grasped with supernatural clarity. Sarah watched these interactions with growing wonder, seeing her daughter blossom under Padre Pio's guidance. The changes were subtle but undeniable. Emily's complexion gained color, her eyes sparkled with new life, and even her posture in the wheelchair seemed more confident. More remarkably, she began sharing insights that seemed impossible for a child her age, speaking about suffering and redemption with wisdom that left experienced theologians speechless. However, darker forces were gathering. Thompson's reach extended to the Vatican itself, where questions began circulating about the appropriateness of Padre Pio's extended involvement with the case. The monastery received official inquiries about their visitor policies, thinly veiled suggestions that they were risking their reputation. Father Giuseppe spent long hours defending their position to his superiors, his own faith in Emily's special case never wavering. Local opposition grew as well. Some townspeople, concerned about their community becoming a circus of miracle seekers, began treating the Andersons with cold politeness rather than their initial warmth. Maria, their stalwart supporter at the hotel, faced criticism from her family for her continued assistance to the Americans. Anonymous notes appeared under their door, suggesting they had overstayed their welcome. Yet for every voice raised against them, another rose in support. A group of local mothers, moved by Emily's story, began taking turns cooking meals for them. Young priests from neighboring parishes visited to witness the child's extraordinary faith, leaving transformed by her simple yet profound understanding of divine love. Even some of the initial skeptics found their doubts weakening in the face of Emily's unwavering conviction and Padre Pio's evident commitment to her spiritual journey. The tension reached a critical point when a representative from the American embassy arrived, ostensibly to check on their welfare. His questions, though politely phrased, carried underlying threats about passport issues and the legality of extended stays for medical purposes. Sarah recognized Thompson's hand in this new pressure, but Emily's response to the official left him visibly shaken. "God doesn't need a passport to work miracles," she said simply, her clear eyes meeting his with disconcerting directness. Padre Pio himself remained unperturbed by the growing controversy. When advised to distance himself from the situation, he responded with uncharacteristic sharpness, "God sent this child to teach us about faith. Would you have me turn away an angel because of worldly concerns?" His support never wavered, though the personal cost to his health and reputation became increasingly evident. Each morning brought new challenges and subtle threats. Thompson's lawyers began approaching other families at the monastery, seeking testimonies about inappropriate influences on vulnerable pilgrims. International media outlets picked up the story, painting it either as a heartwarming tale of faith or a troubling example of religious exploitation, depending on their perspective. The monastery's daily routine was disrupted by an increasing flow of journalists and skeptics, all seeking to prove their particular version of the truth. Through it all, Emily maintained a serene confidence that amazed everyone around her. When Sarah expressed worry about the growing opposition, her daughter simply smiled and said, "Remember what Padre Pio told us, Mummy, sometimes the devil fights hardest when God is about to do something beautiful." These words would prove prophetic as events moved toward their extraordinary culmination. The morning of the miracle dawned unlike any other at the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, though none could explain why. Padre Pio had requested a special mass, and despite the controversy surrounding the Andersons, the small chapel was filled to capacity. Emily sat in her wheelchair at the front, her face glowing with an inner light that made several witnesses later claim she looked almost transparent, like a living stained glass window. Sarah noticed something different about her daughter that morning. Emily had woken before dawn, insisting on wearing the white dress that Maria had lovingly pressed for her. "Daddy came to me again last night," she whispered during breakfast. He said, "Today everything changes, not just for us, but for everyone who needs to believe." The child's certainty sent shivers down Sarah's spine, reminiscent of the faith she herself had lost and was only now beginning to rediscover. Padre Pio appeared more frail than usual as he began the Mass, his movements careful and measured. Yet his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the chapel. He spoke of faith and suffering, of divine love and human doubt, his words weaving a tapestry of hope that transcended language barriers. Even those who couldn't understand Italian found themselves moved to tears by the raw emotion in his voice. The first sign that something extraordinary was occurring came during the consecration. Witnesses would later describe seeing a subtle glow emanating from both Padre Pio and Emily, though photographs taken at the time showed nothing unusual. The temperature in the chapel dropped noticeably, causing breath to mist in the air, despite the warm Italian morning. Emily sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the altar, with an intensity that drew every gaze to her. When Padre Pio approached to give her communion, time seemed to stand still. He paused before her, holding the host, and spoke words that only she could hear. Emily's response, though whispered, carried clearly through the hushed chapel. "I believe, Father, not just for me, but for all of them." The stigmatic priest's hands trembled as he placed the host on her tongue, his own eyes filling with tears. What happened next would be recounted thousands of times, documented in dozens of sworn testimonies, yet would remain forever beyond simple explanation. Emily suddenly gasped, her small body straightening in the wheelchair. A sound like distant thunder rolled through the chapel, though the sky outside remained perfectly clear. Padre Pio stepped back, his stigmata beginning to bleed freely for the first time in months. Sarah watched in astonishment as her daughter's hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests. Emily's face showed no fear, only a deep concentration that seemed to draw strength from some unseen source. Slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had never walked, she began to rise. The entire congregation held its breath, the silence broken only by the soft ping of rosary beads slipping from nerveless fingers. "Mummy," Emily said clearly, standing now beside her empty wheelchair, "God wants everyone to know He hasn't forgotten them." Her first steps were hesitant, but sure, moving toward the altar with a purpose that transformed her ordinary movement into something profound. Padre Pio stood weeping openly, his hands raised in blessing as Emily walked past him to touch the altar cloth. The chapel erupted in a chaos of reactions, cries of joy, prayers of thanksgiving, sobs of overwhelming emotion. Someone began singing "Amazing Grace," the hymn quickly taken up by others in a dozen different languages. Yet through it all, Emily maintained a remarkable composure, turning to face the congregation with a smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom of heaven. Journalists who had gathered outside the chapel, hoping to document another failed miracle claim, found themselves recording something that defied their cynicism. Even the most hardened skeptics among them struggled to explain how a child with documented paralysis was now walking freely, her movements becoming more natural with each passing moment. Medical professionals in attendance began immediate examinations, their initial doubts giving way to bewildered acceptance. The miracle's impact rippled outward from that small chapel like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Those present found themselves changed in ways that went beyond witnessing a physical healing. Hardcore skeptics felt their worldviews shift, while believers discovered their faith deepened into something more profound than simple belief. The very atmosphere seemed transformed, as if a thin veil between heaven and earth had momentarily lifted. Sarah fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Emily walked to her mother, her steps now confident and sure, and lifted her face with small hands that no longer trembled with effort. "Don't cry, Mummy," she said softly. "This is just the beginning of what God wants to show people." Padre Pio, watching this exchange, nodded in profound agreement, understanding that the true miracle extended far beyond physical healing. Within hours of Emily's miraculous healing, San Giovanni Rotondo transformed from a quiet pilgrimage site into the epicenter of a global media storm. Jennifer Walker, a veteran investigative reporter from the Boston Globe who had been quietly following the Anderson story, broke the news first with an article that would later win a Pulitzer Prize. Unlike the sensationalized coverage that followed, her piece focused on the human elements, the years of suffering, the loss of Michael, and the unwavering faith of a child that had moved even the most hardened skeptics. The monastery's ancient walls could barely contain the flood of journalists that descended upon them. Television crews from every major network set up camp in the town square, their satellite trucks creating a peculiar contrast against the medieval architecture. Local residents found themselves being interviewed in broken English, trying to explain what they had witnessed. Maria, who had supported the Andersons from the beginning, became an unexpected celebrity when her tearful account of Emily's journey went viral. Dr. Thompson's carefully constructed empire began to show its first cracks under the intense scrutiny. Walker, digging deeper into the story, uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths and covered up medical mistakes at Boston Metropolitan. Former employees, emboldened by Emily's miracle, started coming forward with evidence of systematic corruption. Documents mysteriously appeared on Walker's desk, revealing financial transactions that linked Thompson to Morrison's fraudulent healing scheme. The media narrative shifted dramatically when a young intern from Thompson's hospital leaked security footage showing the doctor discussing ways to discredit the Andersons. The video, though grainy, clearly captured Thompson saying, "That brat's miracle could ruin everything we've built. Make sure she never walks. Whatever it takes." The public's reaction was swift and merciless. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting Emily, while protesters gathered outside Boston Metropolitan demanding Thompson's resignation. Medical experts from around the world converged on San Giovanni Rotondo, eager to examine Emily. Their findings proved impossible to dismiss. Her healing defied all scientific explanation. X-rays showed perfectly formed bones where there had been malformation. Nerve endings functioned as if they had never been damaged, and her muscle strength developed at an unprecedented rate. The world's leading neurologists published papers attempting to explain the inexplicable, their theories growing more elaborate as each natural explanation failed. Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight as Emily's story resonated with millions. Talk show hosts competed for exclusive interviews, while publishers offered lucrative book deals. But it was their quiet moments of testimony, shared with other families facing similar struggles, that truly captured the public's imagination. Emily's simple wisdom and unwavering faith, now matched by her physical healing, offered hope to those who had none. The investigation into Boston Metropolitan expanded rapidly. Walker's reporting revealed a complex web of corruption that extended far beyond one hospital. Insurance fraud, unnecessary procedures, falsified research data, each revelation seemed to lead to another, darker discovery. Other journalists joined the hunt, uncovering similar patterns at hospitals across the country. The healthcare industry faced a reckoning as public trust eroded. Thompson's attempts to maintain control grew increasingly desperate. His lawyers tried to intimidate witnesses, while his PR team worked overtime to spin the story. But even his most loyal supporters began distancing themselves as evidence mounted. The hospital board, facing pressure from shareholders and the public, called an emergency meeting. Thompson arrived to find his access cards deactivated and his office being searched by federal investigators. The story took an unexpected turn when Dr. Webb, the physician responsible for Emily's initial injury, came forward with a full confession. In a tearful interview, he detailed years of covering up medical mistakes at Thompson's direction. His testimony, combined with the documents already uncovered, provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed. The arrests began early one morning, with FBI agents leading Thompson and several administrators out of the hospital in handcuffs. Throughout the media frenzy, Emily remained remarkably centered. When asked about Thompson during interviews, she consistently responded with compassion. He needs prayers more than punishment. Her attitude influenced public discourse, gradually shifting it from vengeance to reform. Healthcare advocacy groups cited her case in pushing for systemic changes, while religious leaders pointed to her example of forgiveness in the face of grievous wrongs. Padre Pio's role in the miracle received particular attention, with religious scholars and skeptics debating its significance. The Vatican launched an official investigation, sending observers to interview witnesses and examine documentation. Their preliminary findings, unusually quick and decisive, acknowledged the occurrence of an extraordinary healing event that current medical science cannot explain. This official recognition added weight to the already compelling story, drawing even more pilgrims to San Giovanni Rotondo. Success often breeds contempt, and the Andersons' miracle was no exception. As Emily's story captivated the world, darker forces emerged from the shadows. Anonymous threats began arriving at their temporary residence in San Giovanni Rotondo, ranging from crude warnings to elaborate theological arguments attempting to debunk the miracle. Some claimed Emily's healing was a carefully orchestrated hoax, while others suggested more sinister explanations involving experimental drugs or hypnosis. Thompson's remaining allies launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the miracle. Medical experts appeared on television shows, offering alternative explanations that grew increasingly far-fetched. They suggested that Emily's paralysis had been psychosomatic all along, or that she had secretly been receiving experimental treatments. One particularly cruel theory implied that Michael's suicide had been staged to generate sympathy for an elaborate con game. The attacks became personal and vicious. Sarah found herself accused of being an attention-seeking mother who had exploited her daughter's condition for fame and profit. Social media trolls dug into their past, twisting every detail of their struggle into something suspicious. The photos of Emily in her wheelchair were analyzed and declared obviously staged, while her current ability to walk was attributed to everything from hidden technology to mass hysteria. Even within the religious community, voices of doubt emerged. Conservative theologians argued that the age of miracles had passed, suggesting that any apparent healing must have a natural explanation. Liberal scholars proposed that the entire event was a mass psychological phenomenon, pointing to historical cases of collective religious experiences. Some went so far as to question Padre Pio's involvement, implying that the aging stigmatic had been manipulated for publicity. The pressure began taking its toll on their supporters. Father Giuseppe faced increasing scrutiny from his superiors, who worried about the monastery's reputation. Maria received threatening phone calls at the hotel, warning her to distance herself from the Americans. Even Jennifer Walker, whose reporting had helped expose Thompson's corruption, found her professional integrity questioned by colleagues who suggested she had become too emotionally invested in the story. Emily, however, faced the harshest scrutiny. Every public appearance was analyzed for signs of deception. Professional skeptics followed her movements, waiting for her to stumble or show any weakness that might prove the miracle false. Children at their temporary school were encouraged by some parents to avoid the American fraud, leaving Emily isolated despite her newfound ability to participate in normal activities. The backlash reached a frightening peak when a self-proclaimed truth-seeker attempted to force his way into their apartment, claiming he would expose the truth even if it meant harming the child. Though quickly apprehended by police, his actions sent shockwaves through the community and highlighted the dangerous obsession some had developed with disproving the miracle. Sarah watched helplessly as her daughter's beautiful gift became a source of controversy and danger. Security measures were implemented around the monastery, changing its atmosphere from one of peaceful prayer to guarded watchfulness. Even their daily walks to church became tense affairs, with both supporters and detractors watching their every move. Through it all, Emily maintained a serene disposition that confused her critics and strengthened her defenders. When asked about those who doubted her healing, she would smile and say, "They're just scared of believing in something they can't control." Her simple wisdom and unwavering faith stood in stark contrast to the complicated theories and angry denunciations of her opponents. In the midst of the growing controversy, Sarah faced her own private battle with doubt. Late at night, alone with her thoughts, she found herself questioning everything, not just the miracle, but her entire journey of faith. The weight of public scrutiny combined with her still raw grief over Michael's death created a perfect storm of emotional turmoil. She began having nightmares about Emily returning to her wheelchair, waking in cold sweats to check on her daughter's ability to walk. The strain began showing in unexpected ways. Emily, despite her outward serenity, started experiencing moments of inexplicable pain. Though she could still walk, there were days when her legs trembled with fatigue, causing critics to pounce on any sign of weakness. Medical experts who had verified the miracle found themselves unable to explain these episodes, leading to renewed speculation about the healing's permanence. Padre Pio's health deteriorated rapidly during this period, adding to the growing sense of crisis. The elderly stigmatic spent hours in prayer, often emerging from his cell looking more exhausted than ever. During one particularly difficult meeting, he warned Sarah of darker times ahead. "The devil fights hardest," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "when God's work is most evident. You must prepare for a storm that will test your faith to its very limits." The monastery itself seemed to reflect the growing darkness. Pilgrim numbers dwindled as negative publicity spread, leaving the once bustling corridors eerily quiet. Those who did come often appeared more interested in proving fraud than seeking spiritual guidance. The joyful atmosphere that had followed the miracle gave way to an almost oppressive tension, with every shadow seeming to hide a potential critic or threat. Emily's natural cheerfulness began to fade under the constant pressure. Though she never complained, Sarah noticed her daughter spending more time alone, drawing pictures of her father and whispering prayers that sometimes turned to tears. When asked about her conversations with Michael in her dreams, Emily would only say, "Daddy says the hardest part isn't over yet," a cryptic warning that haunted Sarah's thoughts. The local community, once so supportive, started showing signs of fatigue. The constant media presence disrupted daily life, and some began to resent the attention the Andersons had brought to their quiet town. Even Maria, their steadfast friend, advised them to consider returning to America, suggesting that distance might help calm the growing storm. Financial pressures added to their struggles. The modest donations that had sustained them dwindled as public opinion shifted. Publishers who had offered book deals now hesitated, citing concerns about controversy. Sarah found herself counting coins for meals, remembering with bitter irony the days when Thompson's lawyers had accused them of seeking profit through their daughter's condition. One particularly dark night, after a day of especially harsh media coverage, Sarah found Emily standing at their apartment window, looking out at the monastery silhouetted against the sky. "Sometimes," the child said softly, "God lets things get really dark so people can see the light better when it comes." The simple wisdom of her words contrasted sharply with their circumstances, highlighting the growing gap between Emily's faith and the world's cynicism. Padre Pio's warning proved prophetic as events continued to spiral. Anonymous sources began leaking personal details about their life in Boston, twisted to cast doubt on their character. Old neighbors were interviewed, their casual observations transformed into damning evidence of deception. Even Emily's school records were somehow obtained and scrutinized, with normal childhood incidents reframed as signs of early manipulation. The tide began to turn on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning when Jennifer Walker received an anonymous package at the Boston Globe. Inside, she found meticulously documented evidence of Thompson's decades-long corruption, including surveillance footage, internal memos, and financial records that painted a devastating picture of systematic abuse of power. The source, revealed later as Thompson's own personal assistant, had been secretly gathering evidence for years, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The documents revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Thompson hadn't just covered up medical mistakes, he had actively profited from patient suffering. The records showed how he had connected desperate families with fraudulent healers like Morrison, taking substantial kickbacks from their false hopes. Emily's case was just one among hundreds, though her miracle had unwittingly become the catalyst for his downfall. Federal investigators, armed with this new evidence, moved swiftly. Dawn raids at multiple locations yielded computers, documents, and offshore account details that corroborated every accusation. Thompson's carefully constructed facade crumbled as his closest allies rushed to cooperate with authorities, each seeking to save themselves. The man who had once seemed untouchable was reduced to watching his empire collapse from a holding cell. Dr. Webb's testimony proved particularly damning. In exchange for immunity, he provided detailed accounts of Thompson's involvement in covering up medical negligence cases. He described how Thompson had personally ordered Emily's medical records altered, then orchestrated the legal campaign that had driven Michael to suicide. The public outrage that followed was unprecedented, with protests outside Boston Metropolitan growing larger each day. The hospital board, facing mounting pressure and potential criminal charges, voted unanimously to remove Thompson and cooperate fully with investigators. A comprehensive audit revealed decades of financial misconduct, with millions of dollars diverted from patient care into private accounts. Each new revelation strengthened Emily's credibility, as the public began to understand the forces that had aligned against her family. Former patients and their families started coming forward with their own stories of manipulation and abuse. Support groups formed spontaneously, sharing experiences that matched the patterns revealed in Thompson's files. The media, which had been skeptical of Emily's miracle, now focused on the systematic corruption that had tried to suppress it. Stories of other families who had been directed to Morrison emerged, creating a clear picture of an organized scheme to exploit desperate parents. In San Giovanni Rotondo, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Those who had doubted Emily's miracle were confronted with undeniable evidence of the forces that had worked to discredit her. Local citizens who had grown weary of the controversy now rallied around the Andersons, seeing them as victims of a massive injustice rather than seekers of attention. The monastery once again filled with pilgrims, this time coming to witness not just a miracle of healing, but a miracle of truth prevailing over power. Padre Pio, though weakened by illness, received the news with quiet satisfaction. "God's time is not our time," he told Emily during one of their meetings. "Sometimes he allows evil to grow strong so that its defeat will show his power more clearly." His words proved prophetic as Thompson's empire continued to unravel, revealing layer after layer of corruption that had seemed insurmountable just months before. The final blow came when Morrison was arrested in South America, living under an assumed name. His confession implicated Thompson in a global network of medical fraud, confirming that their targeting of the Andersons had been deliberate and calculated. But the man who had stolen their savings and contributed to Michael's death would now face justice, along with those who had protected him. In the wake of Thompson's downfall, something unexpected began to unfold, a wave of redemption that touched even those who had been most hostile to the Andersons. Dr. Thompson himself, facing decades in prison, experienced a profound transformation. During his trial, when Emily and Sarah attended the proceedings, he broke down in tears, publicly confessing not just his crimes but the spiritual emptiness that had driven them. His request to meet with Emily, though initially met with skepticism, led to a moment of reconciliation that moved even the most hardened courtroom observers. The hospital staff, who had remained silent out of fear, began their own journey of healing. Many approached Sarah privately, sharing their struggles with guilt and their admiration for Emily's unwavering forgiveness. The nurse who had first noticed the problems during Emily's birth finally found the courage to testify, her truth-telling inspiring others to come forward. Together, they formed a support group dedicated to reforming hospital practices and supporting families affected by medical negligence. Morrison's captured network of fake healers started crumbling, with several members choosing to cooperate with authorities. Their testimonies revealed how they had specifically targeted vulnerable families, but also showed their own struggles with conscience. One particularly remorseful member used his skills in fundraising to establish a foundation helping families affected by medical fraud, naming it after Michael Anderson as a gesture of atonement. The community in San Giovanni Rotondo embraced a deeper understanding of miracles and faith. Those who had doubted Emily now sought her forgiveness, touched by her consistent grace under pressure. Maria's Hotel became a gathering place for pilgrims and locals alike, where stories of healing, both physical and spiritual, were shared. The town itself seemed transformed, its ancient streets now witnessing a different kind of miracle, the healing of broken trust and divided communities. Even the media underwent a transformation. Journalists who had written skeptical pieces about Emily's healing published retractions, not just about the facts but about their own biases. Jennifer Walker's ongoing coverage expanded beyond the scandal to explore themes of faith, forgiveness, and redemption, earning her not just professional accolades but a personal transformation in how she viewed spirituality and healing. Dr. Webb, though facing his own legal consequences, found purpose in advocating for medical reform. His insider knowledge of corrupt practices helped authorities dismantle similar schemes across the country. Through his cooperation, countless families received justice and compensation. Though he couldn't undo the past, his efforts to prevent future tragedies became a form of penance that brought him unexpected peace. Padre Pio watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, seeing in them the fulfillment of what he had sensed in Emily from the beginning. True miracles, he told visitors, are not just about physical healing, but about the transformation of hearts. His own health, though still fragile, seemed strengthened by witnessing how Emily's simple faith had catalyzed such widespread change. The most profound redemption, however, came through Sarah herself. The bitterness that had threatened to consume her after Michael's death gave way to a deeper understanding of forgiveness. She began counseling other families facing similar struggles, sharing not just her story but the wisdom gained through their journey. Her pain became a bridge to help others find healing, just as her daughter's miracle had become a bridge between doubt and faith. Local churches, once divided over the validity of Emily's healing, united in supporting programs for families affected by medical fraud. The same communities that had whispered accusations now organized practical support for victims, transforming skepticism into active compassion. Emily's story became not just a tale of physical healing but a catalyst for community restoration. 15 years after the miracle at San Giovanni Rotondo, Emily Anderson stood at the podium of Harvard Medical School's graduation ceremony as valedictorian. Her speech, titled Faith in Healing, drew parallels between scientific understanding and spiritual transformation, touching hearts just as she had done as a child. The young doctor's journey from a wheelchair-bound girl to one of the most promising medical researchers of her generation had become a testament to both divine intervention and human perseverance. The Emily Anderson Foundation, established with the compensation from Thompson's case and donations from around the world, had grown into a powerful force for healthcare reform. Operating from a renovated wing of Boston Metropolitan, the very hospital where her story began, the foundation specialized in supporting families affected by medical negligence, while also funding research into unexplained healings. Sarah served as its executive director, her experiences helping to bridge the gap between traditional medicine and spiritual care. Their old apartment in Boston had been transformed into a counseling center, where Sarah spent her weekends working with families facing similar challenges. The walls, once witnesses to Michael's despair, now displayed hundreds of photos of healed families and transformed lives. Michael's presence remained honored through a scholarship program for children of suicide victims, turning their family's darkest chapter into a source of hope for others. Emily's medical research focused on the intersection of faith and healing, earning both acclaim and controversy in academic circles. Her papers on spontaneous remission and the role of spiritual belief in recovery rates challenged traditional medical paradigms while maintaining rigorous scientific standards. She became known for treating not just the body but the spirit, often spending hours with patients just listening to their stories. The impact of their story continued to ripple outward. Medical schools began incorporating courses on spiritual care and patient dignity, with Emily frequently invited as a guest lecturer. Hospitals across the country adopted reforms inspired by the Anderson case, implementing stricter oversight and more compassionate care policies. The term Emily's protocol became medical shorthand for ensuring ethical treatment of patients facing severe diagnoses. Sarah's transformation was equally profound. The angry, grieving widow had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles. Her book, Walking with Emily, became required reading in medical ethics courses, its honest portrayal of struggle and redemption touching a chord with healthcare professionals and patients alike. She maintained a close relationship with Maria from San Giovanni Rotondo, who had since established her own support network for pilgrims seeking healing. Father Giuseppe, now elderly but still sharp, continued sharing the story of Emily's healing with new generations of priests. The small chapel where the miracle occurred had become a quiet place of reflection, with a simple plaque commemorating the event. Visitors often reported feeling a special peace there, though Emily herself always insisted that the true miracle was not her healing but the changes it inspired in others. The anniversary of the miracle was now marked by a unique celebration at Boston Metropolitan, where doctors and clergy gathered to discuss the role of faith in healing. Emily's presence at these events, wearing her white coat yet speaking with the same simple wisdom that had touched Padre Pio, served as a living bridge between the scientific and spiritual worlds. Her father's photograph held a place of honor at these gatherings, his sacrifice acknowledged as part of the journey that had transformed not just one family but an entire approach to medical care. Young medical students now sought out Emily's mentorship, drawn by her unique perspective on healing. She taught them what she had learned from Padre Pio, that true healing involved not just medical knowledge, but a profound respect for the human spirit. Her rounds became famous for their combination of clinical excellence and spiritual sensitivity, creating a new model of patient care that honored both science and faith. On the 20th anniversary of the miracle, Emily returned to San Giovanni Rotondo with Sarah. The small Italian town had changed little, its narrow streets still echoing with the footsteps of pilgrims seeking hope. In the monastery chapel, where her life had changed forever, Emily shared her final reflections with a gathering that included both old friends and new seekers, her words carrying the weight of 2 decades of lived experience. Miracles, she explained, are not just moments when the impossible becomes possible. They are invitations to see the world differently. She spoke of Padre Pio's lasting influence, how his understanding of suffering as a pathway to compassion had shaped her approach to medicine. The stigmatic priest's prophecy about her role in bridging faith and science had been fulfilled in ways none could have imagined that morning when she first stood from her wheelchair. Sarah, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, shared her own testimony of transformation. The journey from bitter grief to profound purpose had taught her that healing comes in many forms. Michael's death, though still painful, had become part of a larger story of redemption. His presence lived on in the countless lives touched by the foundation that bore his name, and in the way their family's tragedy had helped reform a broken system. The legacy of their story had grown beyond personal healing. Medical institutions around the world now studied the Anderson case not just for its inexplicable physical cure, but for its impact on patient care ethics. The combination of documented miracle and systemic reform had created a new paradigm for understanding the relationship between faith and medicine. Emily's dual role as physician and miracle recipient gave her unique authority in arguing for an approach to healing that honored both spiritual and scientific truths. During their visit, they spent time with Dr. Thompson, now released and working as a volunteer at a local clinic. His transformation from corrupted administrator to humble healer was itself a testament to the power of redemption. Emily's miracle, he often said, wasn't just her healing, it was how her faith showed us all a better way. His ongoing work with medical ethics boards helped ensure that the changes sparked by their story continued to influence hospital policies. In the monastery's archives, they found Padre Pio's personal journals from the time of the miracle. His written observations revealed how deeply Emily's childlike faith had affected him, providing strength in his final years. The entry from the day of her healing read, "Simply today heaven touched earth, not to prove its power, but to remind us of love's triumph over suffering. The child teaches what I have spent a lifetime learning." Maria, now elderly but still running her small hotel, hosted a gathering where former skeptics and longtime believers shared meals and memories. The town itself had become a symbol of how faith and doubt could coexist and transform each other. Local doctors worked alongside priests, each respecting the other's role in the healing process. The rigid boundaries between scientific and spiritual care had softened, creating space for a more holistic understanding of human wellness. The final evening of their visit, Emily stood in the exact spot where she had taken her first steps. Above the altar, a small plaque bore words from her father's last letter, "Love finds a way." These words had become more than a memorial, they were a testament to how tragedy transformed by faith could bring healing to countless lives. The chapel filled with the same hymn sung on that miraculous morning, voices joining across years and languages to celebrate not just one miracle, but the continuing power of faith to transform lives. As they prepared to leave, Emily placed a single rose at Padre Pio's tomb. "The greatest miracle," she whispered, "is that God uses our deepest wounds to heal others." Her words, caught by the monastery's ancient stones, seemed to echo with 20 years of transformed lives, healed hearts, and renewed faith, a living testament to the enduring power of belief in the face of impossible odds. Emily's miracle at San Giovanni Rotondo transcends the physical healing of a paralyzed child. It stands as a testament to the transformative power of unwavering faith in the face of overwhelming adversity. Through the darkest moments of corruption, loss, and doubt, her childlike belief illuminated a path toward healing not just for herself, but for an entire community. The story reminds us that true miracles often work in unexpected ways, turning tragedy into triumph, despair into hope, and bitter enemies into humble servants of compassion. Padre Pio's insight that God allows darkness to make his light shine brighter finds its proof in how the Anderson family's suffering became a catalyst for systemic change and spiritual renewal. Their journey teaches us that faith, when paired with forgiveness and perseverance, can transform not only individual lives but entire systems, bridging the gap between science and spirituality, doubt and belief, pain and healing. If you've been moved by Emily's miraculous journey, please support our team by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of faith, healing, and redemption. Share this video with your friends and family. Someone out there might need this message of hope today. Don't forget to like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story touched your heart. Would you like to hear part 2 of the Anderson family's incredible journey? Let us know in the comments, and we'll bring you more inspiring stories of faith triumphing over adversity.